process worked, who was involved with it, and ultimately, if I could, what was behind it. Why is the government doing this kind of thing? I never did quite learn why, but I did learn who, and I learned a great deal about how.
Moore is also at the center of what many consider to be the ultimate UFO deception, the MJ-12 affair. A copy of the so-called MJ-12 document was sent anonymously to Bill Moore's associate. It purports to be a briefing paper prepared for President Eisenhower, explaining that crashed saucers and alien bodies have been recovered and that a secret organization of a dozen scientists and officials had been appointed to study and control all UFO material, MJ-12. Most UFO researchers consider the MJ-12 document to be a fake. The Air Force has finally issued a formal statement saying the document is not genuine. However, the details inside the paper aren't so easily dismissed.
More than 30 different pieces of information, little details, that we didn't know before we got the documents, which were received in December 1984. But it turned out to be true. And it really boggles the mind how somebody could have known those things.
If they're real, then they speak for themselves. If they're not real, then they are an extremely elaborate and sophisticated hoax, which, in my opinion, can only have been created by someone inside the government, because there are things in those documents that weren't in the public domain at the time the documents came to us.
Stan Friedman spent several months and thousands of dollars trying to verify the MJ-12 paper. He says he found nothing which would automatically discredit it and remains convinced that MJ-12, or something like it, is very real.
But I'm convinced that there is such a group, and if there isn't, we've made a terrible mistake. Because presidents and intelligence agencies need a group like that.
Jacques Vallée was one of the first writers to suggest that the government might be deeply involved in UFO disinformation. Today, he says, there is ample evidence that such programs continue.
What intrigued me was that those people had linked to psychological warfare activities of the military, which opens the way to the speculation that perhaps the belief in UFOs can be manipulated as part of psychological warfare exercises.
The long and winding paper trail clearly shows that our government in its various forms spies on UFO researchers, infiltrates UFO groups, lies about UFO documents, censors UFO files, threatens UFO witnesses, and weaves vast and elaborate UFO deception programs aimed at confusing and misleading the American public and the rest of the world. The government is acting in the view of many like a frightened child, afraid to face the truth. What are they afraid of, and why can't we be told? More on that as we continue.
In the United States, any person who comes into contact with extraterrestrial beings or material can be locked up for an indefinite period without so much as a hearing. Family members could also be incarcerated, and all property could be seized based on an obscure rule buried in NASA regulations. Ostensibly, the law was meant to allow for the quarantine of astronauts, but its verbiage could be applied to any American citizen. The law typifies NASA's touchiness concerning ETs and UFOs. The space agency simply doesn't want to talk about such subjects. In 1977, for example, President Jimmy Carter asked NASA to resume studying UFOs because there had been so many inquiries from the public. NASA politely but firmly said, no thanks. The now canceled SETI program, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, was renamed by NASA in part because the space agency didn't want people to say it was looking for little green men, even though that's pretty much what it was doing.
I think that there is a cover-up of sorts. I don't know to what degree it is because, of course, it's very hard to tell what's information and what's disinformation.
Former astronaut Brian O'Leary has had first-hand experience with NASA's alien paranoia. Dr. O'Leary was recruited by NASA for a manned mission to Mars, primarily because of his extensive writings about the Red Planet. But when O'Leary took an interest in the so-called face on Mars and suggested it might even be the remnant of an ancient civilization, he encountered stiff opposition.
I did an optical study of the face on Mars, and it took me 4 years to publish the paper. It was finally published in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. The first few attempts to publish it were turned down flat, And the reviewers made such comments as like, Dr. O'Leary shouldn't spend 1 microsecond of his time inquiring into something so ridiculous and so absurd. The mainstream scientists, when they start to look at these pictures, in fact, I know the person that first discovered them. His name is Toby Owen. He's a colleague of mine in planetary science, and he and some of the other people, when they started looking at the pictures, there was kind of a nervous laughter, almost like a teenager looking at pornography, saying, that looks like a face. But then when it comes time to go public, you have to be conservative, or else you might just blow your whole credibility.
In 1993, NASA launched the ill-fated Mars Observer for the purpose of thoroughly photographing the Martian surface. Despite intense public interest in the face and surrounding features, NASA had to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into an agreement that the face region would be photographed. Even then, NASA said it may or may not release any such photos to the public, most likely because it didn't want to add fuel to the ET fire, a point made moot when the Mars Observer allegedly disappeared. Researcher Don Ecker is convinced that NASA has been taken over by the military.
The fact that NASA over the last couple of years have been slowly but surely clearing out their civilian research personnel and have been bringing in retired military personnel. What this suggests is that NASA is going black.
Journalist Ecker points to a 1991 mission of the Space Shuttle Discovery, STS-48, as an example of NASA's participation in a cover-up. This footage was taped from NASA's own satellite signals. It shows several anomalous objects floating in space near the shuttle, objects which NASA says were ice crystals, space debris, or both. But analysis by some of NASA's own consultants casts serious doubt on these excuses. At one point, the footage clearly shows an object make a radical shift in direction, in apparent response to a flash of light emanating from the shuttle. Here's the sequence again. Notice two other objects streaking across space at incredible speeds. Self-propelled ice crystals, or are they something unexplainable?
These objects, in fact, were not ice, were some type of manufactured vehicle, and they demonstrated a propulsion system that we presently on Earth either are not aware of, or if there are elements within the government that is aware of it, they're keeping it under wraps.
To some, this sequence of events suggests a hostile interspace encounter between a U.S. space shuttle and UFOs. To others, it's another in a long string of inconsequential sightings of space junk. The question of whether American astronauts have seen UFOs was settled long ago, even though no astronauts, current or former, are willing to talk about the subject today. Of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, at least 3 reportedly saw anomalous objects. John Glenn saw sparkling fireflies dancing around his capsule. The late Deke Slayton said he repeatedly circled a stationary UFO while piloting a fighter plane. And Gordon Cooper was so certain that the craft he witnessed several times while flying over Europe were of extraterrestrial origin that he wrote a letter stating his opinion to the United Nations. Cooper has since recanted his statement but refuses to answer any questions about what he saw or why he changed his mind. In fact, none of the astronauts who supposedly saw anomalous objects were willing to respond to inquiries, including astronauts Frank Borman and James Lovell, who snapped this photo of 2 luminous objects from space, or James McDivitt, who confided in friends about his own UFO sightings while in orbit.
They can't even tell their spouses, and I either get no answers or I get a very emotional response, almost embarrassment that, that I even asked the question. It's kind of ironic. It's one of these catch-22 situations. If you know, you can't tell. If you don't know anyway.
UFOs have reportedly been monitoring human technology for decades, perhaps centuries. They've followed our planes and experimental vehicles, have been spotted adjacent to rocket and missile tests, and have done the same all over the world.
What I have been told off the record by certain former members of the American space effort was that not only have there been UFOs encountered in many space flights and with the Russians, but that the Americans and the former Soviet Union had a very close covert relationship, working hand in hand in the pursuit of the overall UFO phenomenon.
Under communism, Soviet leaders publicly scoffed at UFO reports, suggesting the whole matter was a capitalist plot. At the same time, the Russians sometimes used UFOs for their own propaganda purposes.
They had launch sites that were secret, and when they launched a rocket, they encouraged the people in the area to believe that what they had seen in the sky was a flying saucer. They actually planted those stories. I think we've done the same thing.
But the Russian military clearly knew that UFOs were real. Hidden in the archives of the Ministry of Defense is solid evidence of Russian UFO encounters, on Earth and in space. What's more, the Russian government knows that the American government knows. Because the Soviets got a jump on the U.S. in the space race, they also had the first outer space UFO sightings. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, reportedly saw UFOs during his flight, but said he was not permitted to talk about it. The second Russian in space not only saw UFOs, but filmed them. One frame of that film, showing several UFOs dancing around the capsule, was published in a Soviet magazine years later. Scientist Ramily Avramenko, one of the chief designers of Russia's Star Wars program, says the Soviet government knew UFOs were from somewhere else since day one of the space race.
At that time, satellites in space were easily countable, but we also saw vehicles whose technical characteristics we cannot match even now. We saw tens of these in 1959. Surely the existence of these vehicles caused problems for the U.S. defense systems, because you are faced with this information as well.
These still classified Ministry of Defense documents, never before seen in public, reveal that Russian spies learned a great deal about UFO encounters involving American astronauts. The Russians are convinced there were several direct encounters with UFOs while American astronauts were on the moon, and that the Americans haven't returned to the moon because we were told to stay away. Several high-ranking military and scientific sources confirm that the Russians knew much about the ongoing UFO cover-up in America. Retired Army Colonel Boris Sokolov was in charge of the Soviets' secret UFO projects for 10 years and says he knew that the U.S. military had constructed 40 UFO listening posts as part of its UFO research.
I think America could learn something. I mean, after we gave lessons to the Russians for 40 years about freedom and liberty and so on, and now they're publishing a lot of stuff. I doubt it that they're publishing everything they have, but at least they are releasing a lot of material, and our military doesn't seem to have changed too much, their attitude.
The big question about the UFO cover-up remains. Why? Some final thoughts on that are just ahead.
When is a secret not a secret? When everyone has heard it, but few pay attention. The UFO cover-up has been so well documented over so many years that it has seemingly become part of our popular mythology. It is not a myth. The government's own secret studies concluded decades ago that UFOs were real. Those studies were suppressed, then replaced by public relations shams. Schemes were hatched to ridicule the topic, to confuse the public, to hide the real information. An extensive paper trail reveals that many people had direct knowledge of the cover-up and that many others tried to get the information but were refused. Government agencies routinely lie about what they know. Other agencies issue ridiculous cover stories and disinformation. Scores of witnesses recall what may be the most important event in history. The government says nothing. Other witnesses, including some of our modern-day heroes, have seen the proof with their own eyes, but are ordered to keep quiet. Good people are threatened and harassed to maintain this non-secret secret. The best evidence makes it abundantly, indisputably clear that someone, somewhere, has a lot more information than the rest of us.
I think that there are people who must have, people in Washington and elsewhere, must have a building full of data that I think the scientific community should have. Data that comes from radar, from sensors on Earth, from sensors in the ocean, and from sensors in space. There is a